The gold envelope sat on Naomi's kitchen counter for 3 days before she opened it. She already knew who it was from. The Han family crest embossed on the seal. The Suwon postmark. The kind of thick, expensive paper that whispered, "We have more money than you will ever understand." She'd seen that paper before, on documents that had slowly taken everything from her. She finally tore it open on a Tuesday morning, standing in her apartment in London, still wearing the blazer she'd worn to a board meeting the night before. The Han family cordially requests your presence at the annual family reunion, to be held at the Han estate, Suwon. Formal attire required. Naomi set the card down on the counter and looked out the window at the gray London sky for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called the one person who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. "It came," she said. The voice on the other end was calm and measured. "I know. Are you going?" She looked at the invitation again. At her name, Naomi Carter Han, printed there as though it had always belonged on their stationery. As though they hadn't spent 14 years pretending she didn't exist. "Yes," she said. "I'm going." She was 9 years old the first time Madame Han Seojin made her eat in the kitchen. It was Chuseok, and the estate was full of relatives dressed in silk hanboks, moving through rooms that smelled of pine and roasted meat. Naomi had come downstairs in the cream-colored dress her father had bought her, her hair pressed and pinned carefully the way her mother used to do it before she died. She was excited. She remembered being excited. Seojin had appeared at the bottom of the staircase and looked at her the way someone looks at a stain on a white tablecloth. "The kitchen table has been set for you," she'd said quietly. "The guests aren't comfortable with disruptions." Naomi had looked past her toward the dining room, where her father sat at the head of a long table surrounded by laughing relatives. He met her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then he looked away and resumed his conversation. She ate alone in the kitchen that night. The housekeeper, a small woman named Mrs. O, had placed a flower next to her bowl without saying anything. Naomi had stared at that flower for the entire meal, refusing to cry. That was the first lesson the Han family taught her. You are not one of us. They taught it repeatedly in different ways for years after that. She was excluded from the family portrait at her own father's 50th birthday. Seojin had told photographers she was a distant relative's guest. At school events, when Korean relatives attended, Naomi was introduced vaguely, her connection to the family blurred by careful misdirection. She heard the words in Korean before she learned to understand them. "Ige nuguya," who is this? And she watched the delicate pause before someone changed the subject. The cruelest part was that it was never loud. It was never screaming or obvious cruelty she could point to and name. It was the specific, practiced silence of people who had decided she was beneath their anger. She left at 22 with a single suitcase and a scholarship to university in London. Her father wired her a sum of money she never touched. She built her own life from nothing, which meant she built it on something real. 7 years later, she was the director of strategic acquisitions at one of London's most respected financial firms. She had a flat in Kensington. She had rebuilt herself carefully, the way you rebuild something that was deliberately broken. And now she had something else. She had the documents. She arrived in Suwon 4 days before the reunion and met Kwon Jae-won at a restaurant in Gangnam that had no sign on the door. He was already seated when she walked in, scrolling through his phone with the quiet focus of a man who was never surprised by anything. He looked up when she sat down, and something in his expression shifted. Not softening exactly, but settling, the way a building settles into its foundation. "You look like you're ready," he said. "I've been ready for 3 years," Naomi said. "I was just waiting for the right room." Jae-won had come into her life 18 months earlier through a business introduction she almost canceled. He ran a private equity group responsible for acquisitions that reshaped 3 of Korea's mid-tier conglomerates. He was quiet in public and devastating in a boardroom. More importantly, he was the kind of man who listened when a woman told him something significant had been stolen from her. Because that was exactly what had happened. 2 years ago, while settling a separate estate matter, Naomi's attorney had found a discrepancy. A trust established by Naomi's late mother, a Korean-American woman who had died when Naomi was 6, had been quietly redirected. The legal language was careful, buried inside 3 layers of financial restructuring. But the conclusion was unavoidable. Seojin had known about that trust, and Seojin had made sure Naomi never received it. It was not a mistake, the attorney had told her. Someone made deliberate decisions over several years to ensure this money never reached you. Someone with access to the original estate documents. Naomi had sat with that information for a long time before deciding what to do with it. She hadn't gone to the police. She hadn't gone to her father. She had gone to work. She'd spent the next 18 months preparing, building a case so thorough and so clean that the truth would be undeniable when it finally arrived in a room full of people who had spent years protecting each other. All she needed was the room. And the Han family, without knowing it, had just invited her into theirs. The night of the reunion was 3 days away. What none of them knew, not Seojin, not the relatives, not even her silent father, was that Naomi wasn't coming back to fit in. She was coming back to finish it. The evening of the reunion arrived with the particular quiet of a Suwon autumn, the kind of stillness that exists just before something breaks. Naomi stood in the hotel suite she'd booked in the city, watching the estate lights flicker in the distance through the window. From here it looked beautiful, a cluster of warm gold windows against the dark hills. If you didn't know what happened inside those walls, you might think it was the kind of place where people were happy. Her phone buzzed. A message from J1. Ready when you are. She looked at herself in the mirror. The gown was black, deep, architectural black, designed by a Korean-born couturier who dressed 3 of the country's most influential women. It was not flashy. It required no accessories to make its point. Simply said, "I am not who you remember." She picked up her clutch. Inside it was a single USB drive. The black car pulled through the estate gates at exactly 8:15. She could feel the shift the moment they stepped out. The valet who moved to take the keys stopped when he saw J1 and stood slightly straighter. A woman near the entrance recognized him and turned to whisper to her husband. A ripple moved through the gathered guests. Slow at first, then faster, the way a current moves through water. Naomi walked beside him without hurrying. She heard the whispers before she reached the doors. Some in Korean, some in English. The family had invited international business partners tonight, which was precisely why Seojin had planned this particular gathering. She wanted an audience. She just hadn't specified for what. Inside, the estate looked exactly the way Naomi remembered it, except now she could see the calculation in every detail. The art on the walls curated for impressiveness rather than meaning. The floral arrangements designed for photographs. Even the relatives' expressions had a rehearsed quality. The smile that arrived exactly half a second after recognition, indicating it was a choice rather than a reflex. Then Seojin appeared at the top of the entrance stairs. For a moment, neither woman moved. Naomi had thought about this moment. She'd rehearsed the different versions of it, the version where she felt nothing, the version where the old wound opened again and she had to hold herself very still. What she hadn't predicted was this. The way Seojin aged in real time as she looked at her. As if something she had been quietly certain about for years was dissolving. Naomi. Seojin's voice was perfectly controlled. What a surprise. You sent the invitation, Naomi said pleasantly. I assumed you expected me. A beat of silence. Around them, guests pretended not to listen. J1 nodded politely to Seojin and then touched the back of Naomi's arm. A gesture so natural it was immediately legible to everyone watching. He was not there as a business contact. He was there as a man who had chosen a side. Seojin's composure held, but her eyes moved differently now. Quickly, calculating, landing on the relatives nearby, on the business partner stationed near the bar, on her own husband who stood across the room and had just seen his daughter walk in for the first time in 7 years. Naomi's father, Han Ji-chul, looked older. He was standing near the window with a glass of whiskey held loosely in one hand. And when he saw her, his face did something she hadn't expected. It didn't arrange itself into guilt or performance. It simply fell open, briefly, like a door with a broken latch. As if the man behind the careful husband, the careful executive, the careful coward, that man was still in there, and he recognized what he had let happen. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked away. Not yet. The dinner moved with the precision of events that had been planned obsessively. 8 courses. Carefully seated arrangements. Naomi had been placed at the far end of the table, positioned near the younger relatives and away from the business partners. An old technique. Control the geography and you control the narrative. But J1 had been seated beside her, and wherever J1 sat became, by social gravity, the center of the room. 3 of the business partners migrated to their end of the table within the first hour. Not because of Naomi initially, because of him. But he made sure the conversations included her, and he did it without announcing it. He simply responded to her points directly, cited her professional assessments, treated her authority as the obvious thing in the room. By the second course, the partners were directing questions to her independently. At the other end of the table, Seojin watched with a stillness that had moved past composure into something else entirely. One of the relatives, a cousin named Yoonji who had once told Naomi her presence at family events was uncomfortable for everyone, approached during a pause between courses and smiled with sudden warmth. "Naomi, it's been so long. You look absolutely—" "I know," Naomi said, and turned back to her conversation. Yoonji stood there for a moment with the smile still arranged on her face, then quietly withdrew. By the end of the main course, the table had divided itself without anyone formally acknowledging it. The business partners were clustered at Naomi's end. The family was watching from the other, and Seojin, for perhaps the first time in her carefully managed life, understood that she had miscalculated the terrain entirely. What she didn't know yet was that the dinner wasn't the event. The dinner was the prelude. After dessert, Naomi excused herself from the table, retrieved her clutch from the code attendant, and found the estate's private presentation room. Her hands were steady. The USB drive was warm from being held. In 15 minutes, every person in that estate would know what Seojin had done. And this time, there would be nowhere to redirect the conversation. The room filled quickly. It was J1 who had arranged it, discreetly, over the past 48 hours. A quiet word to the right business partners. "There's a matter of financial documentation that concerns several of you directly." That was all it took. When powerful people are told their interests might be affected, they come. Seojin arrived last, guided in by her husband's hand on her back, the expression on her face still dressed as confidence. She looked around the room, at the business partners standing along the walls, at the relatives who had followed out of instinct, at Naomi standing at the front with a laptop already open, and her expression finally shifted into what it actually was: fear. Naomi began without preamble. 14 years ago, when my mother died, she left a trust established in my name. It was modest, the kind of provision a woman makes when she knows her child will grow up without her. She paused. That trust was rerouted through a series of controlled estate restructurings over a 4-year period. The authorizing signatures on 3 of those documents belonged to one person in this room. Total silence. She turned the laptop screen toward the room and stepped aside. The documents were clear. A forensic accountant had annotated each signature, each transfer, each date. The timeline was inescapable. Someone near the back said Seojin's name in a low, sharp tone. Seojin stood still. "These documents are taken out of context." "The context is my mother's name," Naomi said. "The context is that I grew up eating alone in kitchens at my own family's gatherings, while you presented yourself as a guardian of this family's integrity." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The context is 14 years. The room was so quiet she could hear the estate's garden fountains outside. Han Jiaichul, standing near the door, made a sound that wasn't quite a word. He was looking at the documents on the screen with the expression of a man watching himself be revealed in stages. Not just Seojin's deception, his own. His silence. His 17-year arrangement with the easier version of things. "Naomi." His voice broke on the second syllable. She looked at him. For a long moment she let herself see him fully, the man who had wired her money instead of protection, who had chosen a quiet life at the cost of his daughter's dignity, who had looked away at a Chuseok dinner 30 years ago and kept looking away until she stopped needing him to look. "I'm not doing this to hurt you," she said. "I'm doing this because it is true. and because true things deserve to be said out loud. He nodded. Once. The smallest possible motion, but it held the weight of everything he hadn't said for 2 decades. One of the business partners spoke next. A measured, deliberate man named Chairman O who had been reviewing the documentation on his own phone. "I'll need our legal team to review this tonight," he said to the room. "Several of us have existing arrangements with the Han Group that will require reevaluation in light of this." That sentence, delivered quietly in a room full of people who measured their lives in financial arrangements, was more devastating than anything Naomi could have said. Seojin finally looked directly at her. "You think this makes you powerful," she said. "No," Naomi replied. "I think the truth makes me right." That was always enough. She closed the laptop. The meeting was over. She walked out of the estate an hour later. Not through the service entrance. Not through the back garden the way she used to slip out as a teenager to avoid the relatives. Through the front doors, past the same valet, down the same steps where she'd arrived. Jae-won fell into step beside her. Neither of them spoke until they reached the car. "How do you feel?" he asked. She thought about it. She had expected to feel lighter, the dramatic lightness of a weight lifted, the movie version of release. Instead, she felt something quieter and more durable. The specific solidness of a person who has told the truth in a room that preferred silence. "I feel like myself," she said. He nodded like that was the right answer, and it was. Inside the estate, behind them, the lights were still on. The fountain was still running. The family was still there, beginning the long, difficult work of reckoning with what they had allowed to happen and what it would cost them now. Her father would call her in 2 weeks. She would take the call. She would listen, and she would be honest about what she needed from him if they were ever going to speak as 2 people rather than as wound and source of wound. She didn't know yet if he was capable of that. She thought maybe, with time, he might try. She was no longer waiting. The car pulled out through the gates, and Naomi watched the estate lights disappear in the rear window without turning around to see them go. She had not come back to belong to this family. She had come back to stop pretending she needed to. Some people spend their whole lives trying to be chosen by the people who should have chosen them first. Naomi had spent 3 years building something better. The kind of life that doesn't require anyone's permission. She was 29 years old. She was free, and she was just getting started. If the story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories like this one, follow for the next one.